Today we're in Micah, one of the minor prophets. I wanted to do all of Micah, and then I thought, that's a bit of a big ask. But then Tim did all of Ruth, and I was like, all right, well, if he can do it. No, I'm joking. I'm focusing on Micah chapter 4, verse 1 to Micah chapter 5 to the first half of verse 5. But in order to properly contextualize that passage, I do need to do a cursory overview, like a speed run, I promise, of the book as a whole. So first, who was Micah? Where and when did he live? Right? So he occupied pre-exile Israel, but post-divide Israel. So he's living in Judah after Israel had split, right? So there was like a northern kingdom called Israel and a southern kingdom called Judah, and Micah lived in a small town, Moresheth, in Judah. And so why was it split? Like what was going on in Israel as a whole that caused this split? They disagreed about kingship. So Solomon dies, and the northern tribes are like, all right, we're not going to follow Solomon's son. We're going to follow a different king, right? And the southern Israel, Judah, was like, no, we want to follow the Davidic line. And so the southern kingdom of Judah follow Rehoboam, Solomon's son, and the northern kingdom follow Jeroboam. And this is like a big, sticking point, right? So 10 tribes in the north are like, nope, we don't care about the Davidic line, and 2 tribes in the south are like, we very much care about the Davidic line. And so they are divided. And that means it's not like a great time for Israel, right? A divided kingdom can't stand and all of that. So it didn't look great. Things look kind of grim. And Micah comes into the picture, and he warns it's going to get worse. He doesn't have the best news for Israel throughout his book. He warns that things are going to get a bit grim. And so Micah is full of doom and gloom. Full of it. It's a short book, like 7 chapters, full of doom and gloom. Micah describes a people who have forgotten what it means to follow God and have let greed and corruption take root. The rulers are full of rot. To paraphrase what the Bible Project says, they run the land through bribery and bend the laws to favor the wealthy. And in doing so, they violate the Torah and take advantage of the poor. They deprive the poor of their land, their security, and their hope. They deprive the poor of the very things that God delivered all of Israel out of when he rescued them from Egypt, right? And the priests and the prophets aren't any better. They ought to be leading God's people back to him. They ought to be correcting the errors. They ought to be rebuking. They ought to be changing course, right? But that's not what they're doing. Instead, to borrow Bruce K. Waltke's words, leaders judge for a bribe, priests teach the law for a price, and prophets tell fortunes for money. Put another way, the people that God entrusted to be his mouthpiece to his people are trading hard truths for easy lies and easy money. So there's doom, right? It's not great, but there's a reason for the doom. Micah is not the harbinger of, some unavoidable calamity that's unjustified and unexpected. Micah is warning repeatedly over half a century Judah and Israel to change their ways before God humbles their proud posture and removes his protective hedge from them and allows the enemy to come and wreak destruction on them as a form of justice against them. Because God is for justice, right? He is slow to anger, though, sometimes decades or even centuries slow. Micah was not written or spoken in one setting. It's not a monologue where Micah just keeps repeating the same thing for an hour. Note to self. No, it's a bunch of oracles that have been put together later, but those oracles were spoken literally over half a century. So imagine the exasperation that Micah and God must have felt, right? So if you read Micah on your own and you find it a bit repetitive, it's because it is a bit repetitive. But it's repetitive because the rebellion was repetitive. It's repetitive because they didn't stop rebelling, so Micah didn't stop warning. It's repetitive because of grace. God didn't leave his people to the rebellion and just abandon them. God kept speaking to them in the midst of it because God loved them. So it's repetitive because of grace. Now, unfortunately, God's people didn't repent. And here's the rub. God is slow to anger, absolutely. But he's not incapable of it, right? And sometimes repeated injustice calls for anger. It just does. It's uncomfortable, but it just does. And I'm sure some of you have felt this, right? And I'm sure some of you have been on either side of this, or maybe you've done the repeated thing, or somebody has done the repeated thing to you. And, when somebody has wronged you over and over and over again, and you've asked them to stop over and over and over again, and they haven't, maybe you'd be within your rights to take some sort of punitive action. But maybe you hold off, and maybe you hold off for the sake of being slow to anger, for the sake of patience, for the sake of love, for the sake of grace, for the sake of representing Christ. But eventually, sometimes there's a tipping point, right? Where it's just something has to be done. And so that's where Israel is with God at the time of Micah, at a tipping point. John Piper puts it this way, quote, "Prophets like Micah didn't bring doom. They simply announced the doom which Israel and the nations brought on themselves through sin." But that's not all Micah says. He doesn't just speak doom, he speaks hope. And that's a curious thing about Micah. He continually vacillates between doom, hope, doom, hope, doom, hope. And if you read it, there's 3 clear cycles of oracle of doom, oracle of hope, oracle of doom, oracle of hope, oracle of doom, oracle of hope. It's like he can't warn them without telling them, but don't worry, God is still with you. And, John Piper, again, I like Piper a lot, so there's a couple quotes from him in here. It says, quote, "Probably the reason the book is arranged like this is to make the point that where God and his people are concerned, there is always hope, even in the darkest catastrophe. So Micah mingles gloom and glory through his book." Now, earlier I said God is slow to anger. And that's true, and that's from the Bible, but it's a very short paraphrase and an incomplete paraphrase of that, of the verse where it comes from. So a good example of this is found in Psalm 145, verse 8 to 9. Quote, "The Lord is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. The Lord is good to all, and his mercy is over all that he has made." End quote. And that is where our passage comes in today. It's a beautiful illustration of hope in the midst of destruction, of love in the midst of rebellion, of mercy given when wrath and anger is deserved. And so with that, let's read the passage. It is a bit long, so bear with me. And then we'll kind of break it down and see how we can apply it to our lives. "It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains. And it shall be lifted up above the hills, and peoples shall flow to it. And many nations shall come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between many peoples, and shall decide disputes for strong nations far away. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. But they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. For all the peoples walk each in the name of its God, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. In that day, declares the Lord, I will assemble the lame and gather those who have been driven away and those whom I have afflicted. And the lame I will make the remnant, and those who were cast off, a strong nation. And the Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion from this time forth and forevermore. And you, O tower of the flock, hill of the daughter of Zion, to you shall it come. The former dominion shall come, kingship for the daughter of Jerusalem. Now why do you cry aloud? Is there no king in you? Has your counselor perished? That pain has seized you like a woman in labor? Writhe and groan, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in labor. For now you shall go out from the city and dwell in the open country. You shall go to Babylon. There you shall be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies. Now many nations are assembled against you, saying, let her be defiled, let our eyes gaze upon Zion. But they do not know the thoughts of the Lord. They do not understand his plan, that he has gathered them as sheaves to the threshing floor. Arise and thresh, O daughter of Zion, for I will make your horn iron, and I will make your hooves bronze. You shall beat in pieces many peoples, and shall devote their gain to the Lord, their wealth to the Lord of the whole earth. Now muster your troops, O daughter of troops. Siege is laid against us. With a rod they strike the judge of Israel on the cheek. But you, O Bethlehem, Ephratah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has given birth. Then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel, and he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they shall dwell secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be their peace. So, find this passage notable, almost extraordinary in a few ways. First, it reminds me a lot of Isaiah, right? And I don't have the time today, so I'm not going to do it, to really sketch out the parallels between the areas of Isaiah that point to Jesus and the areas of Micah that I think point to Jesus. But there are parallels there, so it's a worthy thing to study if you're bored or inclined. It is similar, and it's almost like God knew what his people needed to hear. It's almost like he sent two prophets in the same time to the same people to give the same message. Crazy. The other notable thing that I like about this passage is the themes it has, right? Unity, peace, and hope flow throughout it. And so I want to unpack those a little bit. So first, and that means I'm going to read it again, but in little chunks. So first, let's return to chapter 4, verse 2, and chapter 4, verse 5 and 6, and chapter 5, verse 3. 4, verse 2. And many nations shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Verse 5. For all the peoples walk, each in the name of its God, but we will walk in the name of the Lord, our God, forever and ever. And chapter 5, verse 3. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has given birth. Then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel. So remember, God's people are divided at this time, right? They're at odds with one another. Two kingdoms, Israel and Judah. And I wonder how that division was felt daily. You read things about Germany when it was divided, and you read people's stories about how difficult that was to have people they were close to on the other side of the wall. And I don't think it was the same because, families weren't divided in the same way because families were really attached to their tribe, so I don't think it was exactly the same. But I'm sure that there were friendships and relationships that were broken in the division. I'm sure it was deeply felt. These were a people that had gone through so much together, right? They were enslaved together in Egypt. They were delivered together out of Egypt. They wandered the desert together. They received the promised land together. They received God's love and God's law together. and now they're divided? It must have been really hard. And then the reason they're divided is because together they demanded a king, and God told them, bad idea. And they said, nope, we want a king. And God told them, bad idea. And now they're divided because they can't agree on who ought to be king. It would have felt terrible, I'm sure. It would have felt tumultuous. And what does God promise them into that division, into that feeling of uncertainty? He promises them unity in Zion under God's word and law, that, quote, the brothers would return again, unquote, that they would be one people. How great a promise for a divided people. But God doesn't stop there. He doesn't stop at promising restoration and unity. He also promises peace instead of war. So we'll go to chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. He shall judge between many peoples. He shall decide disputes for strong nations far away. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. But they shall sit, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. Remember, God's people are not only at odds with one another internally, but war is an ever-present threat, right? At this period of time, they're surrounded by enemies. War is not some far-off possibility. It's not something they've never experienced. They know the horrors of war, and it feels imminent to them because it is imminent. If you look at when Micah writes, it's like he's alive when the Assyrians come. Like war is coming. And what does God speak into that fear of war? Peace. And how beautiful it must have been to hear a promise that transforms the horror of the sword into something that symbolizes peace and food security. Plowshares and pruning hooks. Humble instruments, right? But they symbolize peace. You can't have agriculture when you're at war. You can't have land that you can grow food on when you're at war. And so God speaks peace and security and land ownership. And I know land ownership is like a weird thing, but for Israel, it was part of the promise, right? Every family had land. It was built in that they could not lose that land. And that was part of what the leaders at this time were doing wrong. They were selling the land of the poor. And it was written that they couldn't do that. A family could not lose their land even if they were poor, right? And so, they were enslaved. They were without land. So God gave them land. And it's at risk. And so God promises them that one day they won't need swords. They'll sit under their own fig tree, their own vine, and they'll tend their own agriculture, their own crops. How great a future for them to have imagined for their children. A future where their descendants won't even learn war anymore. It'll be such a far-off possibility. It's beautiful. And then God speaks hope instead of destruction and despair. And he does that in chapter 4, verses 6, 7, and chapter 4, verse 10. Verse 6, in that day declares the Lord, I will assemble the lame and gather those who have been driven away and those whom I have afflicted. Writhe and groan, verse 10. Writhe and groan, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in labor. For now you shall go out from the city and dwell in the open country. You shall go to Babylon. There you shall be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies. Sorry you had to hear me swallow. I hate that. Anyways, I was thirsty. So note that hope here exists in the midst of destruction, right? The warnings that Micah repeatedly gave, they happen. They come to fruition. The Assyrians come, the Babylonians come, the temple's destroyed, the exile happens. All the warnings happen. But God still delivers his people, and he promises that. In the midst of the warnings, he promises them, I will still be with you. I will not leave you. And remember, at this time, the poor and lame are suffering. They're suffering internally because the rich are taking advantage of them. But I mean, like, if you're poor or lame, you're not going to do super well in an exile, right? Like, it's not going to be great for you. And so God gives a special promise to them. How great of a promise for them to hear that they will be brought back and that they will not be cast off, but will be made strong, that they will be the remnant that God builds up in that moment. So the promises are beautiful, but what's more extraordinary to me is that God gives them at all. Regardless of how bad things got and deservedly bad that they got, God's mercy prevails. As Bruce Waltke put it, quote, "Salvation, not judgment, has the last word. Micah teaches us that God is just, but his mercy is greater," end quote. Right? Remember, God had warned them forever. Please stop, please stop, please stop. And they were like, nope. And yet, God's still like, I'm going to deliver you. Even in the warning, he tells them, I'm going to deliver you. So no wonder when we read Micah, or when I read Micah, especially chapter 5, verse 2, and chapter 5, verse 4 and 5, on this side of the cross, I see Jesus. It's the same story. It's the same gospel. It's about undeserved mercy. And that's really the point of Micah. It's a mini gospel. How many times have we rebelled or brought on destruction? And how many times have we felt beyond repair or beyond deliverance? And how many times have we ignored wise counsel for the sake of our own sinful tendencies? And how many times has our story, if we're honest with ourselves, followed the same patterns that Israel and Judah were following? But God. Right? Beautiful. But God is still there. But God still loves. But God still delivers. Regardless of what we do, but God is there. And so how does a God who loves justice manage to give deliverance in the midst of injustice? Right? How does a God love justice and mercy? Well, for the Israelites and Judah, justice is still served, right? The warnings come to fruition, and then deliverance comes. They were redeemed in the end. For us, on this side of the cross, it's through Jesus, right? Justice is served on the cross, and we are delivered. And so with that in mind, I want to read Micah 5, verse 2, and verses 4 and 5. But you, O Bethlehem, Ephratah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. And he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall dwell secure. For now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be their peace. And just as that promise was true for the original hearers of it, it's true for us. Because of Jesus, God will not let us be destroyed either. Regardless of what situation we find ourselves in, regardless of what we've done or what others have done to us, regardless of what destruction our lives bear, either from our own actions or the actions of others, God is still our deliverer. We are still Jesus' flock. He will still shepherd us in the strength of the Lord, and we will still dwell secure in him. He is still great, and he will still be our peace. What a beautiful promise, and what a wonderful way to deliver it.